Welcome back, everyone. We're ready for another deep dive, and today we're tackling the Enlightenment.
Ooh, exciting.
It is, right? This era between 1650 and 1789.
A period of massive change.
Totally. And we've got a bunch of sources to dig into. Lecture notes, educational goals, even some interesting stuff about museums.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
We do, but that's the fun part. We're going to figure out why this period is still so important today, why it still matters.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of what we consider modern thought, like the very foundation of how we think today.
Can be traced back to those few decades.
Exactly. It wasn't just new ideas, it was a completely new way of looking at the world.
A total shift in perspective.
Yeah,
Okay, so before we get to all the daring to know stuff and all that,
all that jazz.
right, let's rewind a bit. So the Enlightenment didn't just appear out of thin air, right?
Definitely not. It built on what came before it.
Like what?
The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. These movements were all about challenging traditional authorities.
Like the church.
Yes. And they emphasized the power of individual observation and reason.
So like questioning everything they'd been told.
Exactly. Like, hey, wait a minute, maybe the Earth actually revolves around the sun.
And rediscovering all that ancient knowledge.
Right. And figures like Descartes and Locke, they were key in this shift. Descartes, with his focus on rationalism, argued that reason, logic, it's the path to truth.
It all comes down to logic.
Yeah, and Locke, he was all about empiricism. He believed that knowledge comes from our experiences, from what we observe.
From the evidence.
Right. So instead of blindly accepting what they were told, people started saying, hold on, let's test this out, see for ourselves.
Let's experiment. Let's see what happens.
Exactly.
So this shift, it led to that bold new motto for the age. Saper aude.
Which means dare to know.
Ooh, I like it. Dare to know. It's like a battle cry for knowledge.
It really is.
But what did they actually dare to know? I mean, what were some of the big ideas that came out of this dare to know attitude?
Well, they dared to question everything. Religion, politics, economics, you name it.
They questioned the whole system.
Exactly. For example, with religion, Spinoza came along and said, hey, what if God isn't separate from nature? What if God is inseparable from it?
Whoa, that's a big one.
It was a radical concept, right? It challenged the whole idea of God sitting up in heaven judging us.
Not exactly the classic image we're used to.
Right. Spinoza was suggesting we're all part of this grand, interconnected divine order.
Part of the whole thing.
Yeah. And of course, this ruffled some feathers back then.
I can imagine. So Spinoza was like rethinking the very essence of God. And then you've got Voltaire. He was another major figure in the Enlightenment, right?
Absolutely. Voltaire was a champion of freedom of thought and religious tolerance.
Freedom of thought, very important.
Yeah, he believed in an intelligent designer, a God who created the universe.
So he wasn't rejecting the idea of God altogether.
No, but he argued that organized religion, it often twisted this original intent.
So while Spinoza was rethinking the nature of God, Voltaire was more focused on how humans were interpreting and using religion.
You got it.
It's so interesting how they both dared to question religion, but from these different angles.
Right. It shows that the Enlightenment wasn't about everyone agreeing. It was about debating these different ideas, about exploring all these perspectives.
And this questioning spirit, it didn't stop at religion.
No way. It spread to every area of life, including politics.
Ah, politics. That's where Locke comes in, right? Life, liberty, property, all that good stuff.
You got it. Locke's ideas, they were groundbreaking, revolutionary. He said these rights, they weren't granted by some king or queen.
They were inherent to all humans.
Exactly. And that governments, they couldn't just take these rights away.
That must have freaked out the monarchs.
It was a direct challenge to the entire concept of absolute monarchy. Locke was basically saying, hey, monarchs, your power doesn't come from God.
It comes from the people you govern.
Exactly.
Whoa, talk about shaking things up.
He was laying the foundation for modern democracy. He argued that if a government failed to protect those basic rights,
The people have a right to change it.
or even get rid of it completely, this idea of the social contract between the people and the government,
It's huge.
absolutely fundamental to how we think about government today.
It's not just about individual rights. It's about the very relationship between people and their rulers.
And that was a radical concept at the time.
I bet. And I'm guessing not everyone agreed with Locke's take on this relationship.
You're right. Another major thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he also believed in a social contract.
Oh, okay. So where do they differ?
Well, Rousseau argued that individual freedom, it should sometimes take a backseat to the general will of the entire community.
So more emphasis on the collective good.
Right. He believed in a more direct democracy where everyone participated in making the laws.
Interesting. So for Locke, it's all about protecting individual freedom from an overreaching government. And Rousseau's saying, hey, sometimes we need to give up a little freedom for the good of the group.
Exactly. Two different perspectives on the social contract, but both incredibly influential.
Totally. Okay, so we've got religion and politics being turned upside down. What about economics? Did the Enlightenment thinkers have anything to say about money matters?
No, for sure. That's where Adam Smith comes in.
Adam Smith, famous economist.
His book, The Wealth of Nations, it's basically the Bible of modern economics.
Okay, so what did Adam Smith teach us? What were his big ideas?
He argued that individuals acting in their own self-interest in a free market would actually benefit society as a whole.
So, like, if everyone just focuses on making a buck,
The market will take care of itself.
it all works out in the end. Sounds kind of optimistic, no?
It's definitely a complex idea, and it's been debated ever since, but Smith believed that government intervention in the economy should be kept to a minimum.
Let the market do its thing.
Right. He believed the forces of supply and demand, they would naturally regulate things.
So he's like the intellectual grandfather of capitalism.
You could say that. His ideas had a huge impact on economic thought, and they still shape how we think about markets and the role of government today.
Still relevant after all these years.
Definitely.
Okay, so religion, politics, economics, everything's getting a makeover during the Enlightenment. But what about society as a whole? What did these thinkers believe about how society should function?
Well, they were big believers in the power of knowledge and education.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. They believed that education could create a better society. The Enlightenment was all about curiosity, about learning and sharing new ideas.
Like a huge thirst for knowledge.
It really was, and that's where the encyclopedia comes in. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, it's like the Google of its day, right? All the world's knowledge in one place.
Exactly. It was this massive project edited by Diderot and D'Alembert. They wanted to gather and spread knowledge on every subject imaginable.
It's incredible to think about the effort that went into creating something like that before the internet.
Right. Talk about dedication to knowledge.
It really shows how important they thought knowledge was.
And this emphasis on learning, it was all tied to the belief that society could improve, that progress was possible.
That we could make things better.
Exactly. The Enlightenment was full of optimism, a belief in human potential, and the idea that we could create a better future.
Sounds nice. But this belief in progress, in questioning everything, I imagine that caused some tension, especially with the folks in charge.
You're absolutely right. These Enlightenment ideas, especially about limiting government power and individual liberties, they posed a direct challenge to the absolute monarchs who were ruling most of Europe at the time.
So how did these rulers react? Did they just embrace these new ideas?
Not quite. Some of them resorted to censorship, trying to suppress these dangerous ideas.
These ideas are too spicy for the people.
But others took a more, shall we say, strategic approach.
Okay, what does that mean?
We call it enlightened absolutism.
Enlightened absolutism. That sounds a bit like having your cake and eating it too.
It kind of was. These rulers, they tried to blend absolute rule with some Enlightenment principles. So maybe they promoted education or economic reforms.
Yeah, the key is the people.
Right. But they weren't about to give up their power.
So they were down with being enlightened as long as it didn't threaten their throne.
Pretty much.
Classic.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of those rulers?
Yeah, Frederick the Great of Prussia and King Willem I of the Netherlands.
They were both walking this tightrope.
Trying to balance these new ideas with their own authority, it's a fascinating part of the Enlightenment.
It is. These rulers were both influenced by and threatened by these new ideas. It makes you wonder what they really thought about it all.
Right. It was a time of great change, and not everyone was comfortable with it.
And speaking of change, there's this interesting detail in our sources that seems kind of random at first, but it actually connects perfectly to all this Enlightenment stuff.
Oh, this is interesting.
Right. Tell me more.
We're talking about museums.
Museums. Wait, how do museums fit into all this talk of revolution and daring to know?
It's not immediately obvious, but stick with me. The concept of a museum, it goes way back to ancient Greece. Their Maution. It was a place dedicated to the muses,
Muses.
the goddesses of the arts and sciences. So it was a place for inspiration and learning.
A place for the arts and knowledge.
Exactly. And this idea, it got revived during the Renaissance.
With places like the Library of Alexandria.
Exactly. The Library of Alexandria was this incredible collection of knowledge.
It's tragic that it burned down.
It really is. But its spirit lived on. The Enlightenment, with its focus on knowledge, saw the rise of museums as we know them today.
Oh, okay, I see where you're going with this.
Museums became these places to preserve and share knowledge, just like those ancient academies.
They weren't just about old artifacts.
Right. They were about making knowledge accessible to everyone.
Feeding that Enlightenment thirst for knowledge.
Precisely. Museums became hubs for exchanging ideas, for fostering curiosity, and exploring new knowledge.
All those key themes of the Enlightenment.
Exactly.
It's amazing how it all connects. Ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all these threads woven together.
It shows the power of ideas. The idea of a museum, it started in antiquity, was reborn during the Renaissance, and then took on this new form during the Enlightenment. It's like ideas can evolve and adapt over time.
They can be reinterpreted and reused.
Yeah.
That makes me think about how Enlightenment ideas are still evolving today, how they're still being adapted.
It's a great question and something we're going to explore in more depth.
We are.
But first, I think we need a little break. We'll come back and talk about how the Enlightenment's legacy is still shaping our world today.
Sounds good. We'll be right back after a short break.
It's wild to think about how ideas that were radical back then, like freedom of speech, the separation of powers,
Yeah.
they're like core principles of so many democracies now.
Like those Enlightenment thinkers. They planted these seeds, and now, centuries later,
They've grown into the very fabric of our societies. It's true. But speaking of growth, did everyone benefit equally from this blossoming of new ideas? I mean,
that's an important point.
the Enlightenment wasn't exactly known for being inclusive.
Yeah, you're right. The Enlightenment's vision of progress, it wasn't always inclusive. It often left out women, people of color.
Anyone who didn't fit the mold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, progress isn't always a straight line. There were definitely blind spots back then, places where those ideals of liberty and equality.
They fell short.
They did.
The Enlightenment's ideals, they were often more aspirational than fully realized, you know?
Yeah, more like goals to strive for.
Right. And it's our responsibility to grapple with that complexity, to learn from the past.
And keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. I mean, that's what daring to know is all about, right?
Right. Daring to acknowledge the shortcomings, too.
Absolutely.
So, how do we reconcile those shortcomings with the undeniable impact the Enlightenment has had? I mean, it's not like we can just erase the past. It's about understanding that progress within its context, within the time period it happened.
Yeah, it's a product of its time.
And recognizing that we have a responsibility to continue that work, to keep pushing forward, to address the injustices that still exist today.
To keep working on those blind spots.
Exactly.
So the Enlightenment, it wasn't the finish line.
It was the starting point.
And we're still on that journey, figuring things out as we go.
Absolutely. And the journey continues to unfold as we face the challenges of our own time.
Which brings us back to the mission of this deep dive. We're not just learning about the Enlightenment for fun. We're trying to understand
why it still matters.
Yeah, why it matters to us today in the 21st century. What can we learn from these thinkers, these debates, these contradictions even?
What can we take from it?
That can help us navigate the world today.
I think that by exploring these ideas, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, of how we got here, and the world we live in.
We can see how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
Exactly. We can see the progress and the work that still needs to be done.
It's like looking in the mirror, right? You see the good and the bad.
And you acknowledge that you have the power to change what you see reflected back at you.
That's a great way to put it. The Enlightenment's legacy, it's both a source of inspiration and a call to action.
It reminds us that we have the capacity for reason, for progress.
For creating a better future.
But it also challenges us to be honest about the gaps between our ideals and our realities.
Between what we say we believe and what we actually do.
And to make sure those ideals are actually reflected in the world we're building.
It's a challenge, for sure.
It is. And that brings us to a final question for you, our listener.
Ooh, hit me with it. Given the Enlightenment's focus on progress, are we in the 21st century truly living up to its ideals?
That's a big one.
It is.
I mean, we've made incredible strides in science and technology, human rights.
But we're also facing these huge challenges.
Climate change, social inequality, political polarization. And it's in these moments of challenge that I think the spirit of the Enlightenment becomes even more relevant.
It does.
It calls on us to use reason, critical thinking, empathy.
To navigate these complex issues.
To find solutions.
To shape a more just and sustainable future.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Enlightenment, we want to leave you with that question.
To ponder.
What does it mean to be enlightened in our time? How can we honor this legacy while also addressing the challenges we face today?
It's a question worth thinking about
It is.
because we believe that by engaging in these conversations, by questioning assumptions,
By being critical thinkers,
and by striving for a more just and equitable world,
we're continuing the journey that started centuries ago.
we're carrying that torch forward.
It's about taking that torch of reason and progress and using it to light the way forward.
Even when the path is uncertain, even when it's bumpy.
And remembering that just like those Enlightenment thinkers face pushback, we're going to hit roadblocks too.
But by embracing that spirit of inquiry,
Yeah.
by daring to know and challenge what we think we know.
Challenge the status quo.
Exactly.
Mm.
That's how we keep moving forward. It's how we create a world that truly reflects those Enlightenment ideals.
So it's not just about looking back. It's about taking those ideas and
Applying them today.
applying them to the world right now
Yeah.
in the 21st century.
Yeah. And that's why we always encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
Keep learning.
Right. Pick up a book by Locke or Rousseau or Voltaire.
Ooh, good reads.
Right. Talk about this stuff with your friends.
Have those deep conversations.
And never stop questioning, never stop learning.
Because this whole dare to know thing,
It's not a one-time thing.
it's an ongoing journey.
A lifelong process.
And it's a journey we all get to be a part of.
We're all in this together.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Enlightenment.
It's been fun.
It has. We hope you found it, well, enlightening.
We hope you learned something.
We did too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us what you think about this era and what it means for us today. We love hearing from you.
We do.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay open to the wonders of knowledge.
See you next time.
All right, ready to dive deep. Today, it's democratic revolutions and how they shook the world, especially those big ones, the American and French revolutions. And you guys gave us like a whole treasure chest of sources, textbook bits, some intense lecture notes, and even real deal primary sources.
Always exciting to see those connections between these events, how they weave together. And we have just this stuff to unravel it all.
So first things first, let's set the stage. Revolutions don't just kind of pop out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
What was going on in the world that made these revolutions even possible?
Well, picture the Enlightenment as this mental powder keg, right?
Right.
Reason, logic, questioning everything. The old ways of doing things were under fire.
So bunch of thinkers basically saying, hey, maybe kings shouldn't have all the power.
Exactly. And guys like John Locke, his ideas, super important for both revolutions, both in America and France.
Right, John Locke, he was all about those natural rights, right?
Yeah.
Life, liberty, property, that whole thing. But how did that, abstract stuff actually lead to people revolting?
Think of it this way. Locke said governments get their power from the people they govern, not from some, divine right from God. That idea was like a bomb going off in those monarchies where kings ruled everything.
Yeah, I can see how a king wouldn't be too thrilled about that idea.
Right. And these ideas, they really took hold with the American colonists who were getting more and more frustrated with how Britain was running things. They felt like their rights were being trampled on, especially with that whole no taxation without representation deal.
Yeah, that was a big one. It's amazing to see how those Enlightenment ideas actually got people fired up enough to take action.
Yeah, it shows you the power of ideas, how they can shape what actually happens in the world. And it wasn't just Locke either. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he had this idea of the general will that also added fuel to the fire, especially over in France.
General will. Sounds kind of vague. What's that all about?
Basically, it's the idea that the government should reflect what all the people want, not just the king or some small group at the top, but the will of everyone. Pretty radical stuff back then.
I bet. So you have these Enlightenment thinkers planting the seeds, and those seeds sprout into full-blown revolutions.
And each revolution, while sharing those roots, had its own distinct character. Let's look at the American Revolution first.
Okay, let's jump in. Everyone knows the no taxation without representation slogan, but what were some of the things that really pushed the colonists to the breaking point?
Well, like you said, taxes were huge. Britain kept slapping new taxes on the colonists without giving them any say in the matter. Totally went against what the colonists saw as their rights, as Englishmen.
It was about the principle of the thing, not just the money itself.
Exactly. And it wasn't just taxes. There were limits on trade, on moving west, all sorts of things that were making the colonists angry. And then you have Thomas Paine. He wrote this pamphlet called Common Sense. It really captured that anger, gave it a voice, and made a strong argument for independence.
Paine was great at taking complicated ideas and making them understandable, right?
Oh, absolutely. Common sense was like a viral sensation, spreading the idea of revolution like wildfire. He questioned the whole idea of monarchy, said it was outdated, and pushed for republicanism, which, goes back to Locke's ideas about consent of the governed.
So you've got this boiling resentment fueled by Enlightenment ideas, and then Paine comes in and turns up the heat even more. And finally, boom, the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
Right. The Declaration, it wasn't just about saying we're independent. It was a powerful statement of those Enlightenment principles.
Wow.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, straight from Locke. It was a clear break from the old world.
And the colonists, they weren't just all talk. They were ready to fight for that independence.
Absolutely. The American Revolution was putting those Enlightenment ideals to the test, fighting a massive empire for their freedom. And figures like George Washington emerged. Skilled general, symbol of American resilience. He led the charge.
And against all odds, they won.
They did. But even though they won, the revolution's legacy, it's complex.
How so?
Well, the revolution declared that all men are created equal, right? But it didn't deal with the huge problem of slavery. That contradiction would hang over the nation for a long time.
Very true. A step forward, but definitely not perfect.
No revolution ever is. But the American Revolution showed that those Enlightenment ideas could inspire real action, real political change. And its impact, it went way beyond America.
Because over in France, another revolution was brewing. And that one, it seems even more intense, more explosive, ready to dive into the French Revolution.
Absolutely. Similar ideas at play, but the French Revolution took a very different, a much more turbulent path.
Okay, French Revolution time. If the American Revolution was like, controlled burn, the French one was an inferno.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Both had those Enlightenment ideals at their core, but the French Revolution, it was driven by this deep, deep inequality, social and economic, that had been simmering for ages. Remember those lecture notes on the three estates?
Oh yeah, the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else crammed into that third estate. Talk about an unfair system, right?
Exactly. The first and second estate, they had all these privileges, while the third estate, well, they paid most of the taxes and had basically no say in how things were run. It was like a ticking time bomb.
Well, what set it off?
France was in a financial mess, partly because the monarchy was spending like crazy and they had all these costly wars. Louis VI, the king, he was desperate for cash, so he decided to call a meeting of the Estates General. That's a representative body, hadn't met in over 150 years.
He asked the people to help him with his money problems. Sounds a little risky, to say the least.
It was a huge gamble, and let's just say it didn't pay off. The Third Estate, they were inspired by those Enlightenment ideas, emboldened by what happened in America. They wanted real change. More representation, a fair tax system, an end to all those aristocratic privileges.
I bet that didn't go over well with the king. Did he give in to their demands?
Nope, not a chance. The first and second estates, they wanted to hold on to their power. They blocked every attempt at reform. And the third estate, they were fed up. So they did something bold. They declared themselves the National Assembly and said they were going to create a new constitution for France.
Whoa, things escalated quickly. That's a serious power move.
It was a defining moment. Direct challenge to the king, saying that the power belongs to the people.
And this is where the Bastille gets stormed, right? That's like the iconic image of the French Revolution.
Well, you got it. July 14th, 1789, a Parisian mob stormed the Bastille, which was a royal fortress. It had become the symbol of oppression. It wasn't just about breaking out prisoners. It was a powerful message, against the monarchy. The old order was crumbling.
Okay, so the Bastille falls. The king's power is weakened. The National Assembly's in charge. Did France just become a democracy overnight? Well, not exactly. The French Revolution, it was a long, messy process with a lot of ups and downs. The National Assembly, they were inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, so they drafted their own version, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen.
So they were setting the foundation for a new, more just society.
That was the goal. The Declaration, it stated these fundamental rights for everyone, Liberty, equality, fraternity. Those became the core values of the revolution. But actually putting those ideals into practice, well, that turned out to be incredibly difficult.
How so?
The revolution, it unleashed these powerful forces that were hard to control. France was deeply divided. Some people embraced the revolution, others wanted the old ways back. You had moderates who wanted gradual change, and then the radicals who wanted to tear everything down and start over.
So there was fighting even within the revolution itself.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that struggle for power, it shaped the course of the revolution, led to periods of intense violence and instability.
This is where the Reign of Terror comes in, right?
Yeah, yep, that's right. France was facing threats, both from within and outside, and this group, the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, they came to power. They believed that extreme measures were necessary to protect the revolution. They weren't messing around.
And that's when the guillotine became this, like, terrifying symbol of the revolution.
Sadly, yes, the Reign of Terror, it's a dark period, a time of fear and paranoia. Thousands were executed, just suspected of being against the revolution. Even people who had been revolutionaries themselves became victims.
It really shows that even revolutions fought for good reasons can turn into something really awful.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure. But even during those dark times, the French Revolution, it was still spreading those ideas of liberty, equality, and the power of the people. Its impact was felt way beyond France, inspiring other revolutions shaping European history.
And speaking of shaping history, wasn't there this military leader who emerged from all that chaos?
Napoleon, right?
Yes, Napoleon. He enters the scene in this final act of the French Revolution, a twist no one saw coming. This just gets more and more interesting.
Get ready, because Napoleon's story is a wild one. His rise to power reshaped France and the world.
All right, we're back, and I gotta say, that French Revolution was a whirlwind. Now we're talking about Napoleon. From all that chaos to becoming an emperor, talk about a crazy turn of events.
It really is a fascinating twist. See, the French Revolution, even with all the violence and instability, it left this, power vacuum. And that's where Napoleon Bonaparte comes in, this brilliant, ambitious young general ready to seize the opportunity.
So he basically used that instability to his advantage.
Exactly. Napoleon, he was incredibly skilled, both as a military leader and a politician. He climbed the ranks of the army during the revolution, proving himself in battle after battle. In France, they were craving stability, strong leadership, someone to take charge. Napoleon fit the bill perfectly.
And he definitely took charge. But how did he go from general to emperor? I mean, didn't France just get rid of a king? They wouldn't want another monarch, right?
That's a good point. You'd think they'd be done with kings. But the French Revolution, it wasn't just about getting rid of a king, right? It was about creating a whole new kind of government, one that was based on those ideals of liberty, equality, and the power of the people. And a lot of people saw Napoleon as the guy who could bring order to the chaos, who could protect the changes the revolution brought, while also providing that stability and leadership they were longing for.
So they were willing to, sacrifice some of that freedom they fought so hard for in exchange for security and a sense of order.
Yeah, in a way. And Napoleon, he knew how to play to those desires. He presented himself as the true successor of the revolution, the protector of its legacy, even as he was consolidating his own power. And then, in 1804, he crowns himself emperor.
Wow. Talk about bold. So what happened to all those revolutionary ideals, the liberty and equality under Napoleon? Did he just throw them out the window?
It's complicated. Napoleon, he's a really complex figure, a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was definitely an authoritarian ruler. He centralized power, shut down any opposition, and launched all these military campaigns across Europe, basically dragging the continent into war.
Doesn't sound too great for liberty and equality.
No, it wasn't. But at the same time, Napoleon, he also put some important reforms in place that actually reflected those revolutionary ideals. For example, he introduced the Napoleonic Code, which was a legal system that promoted equality before the law. It got rid of those old feudal privileges. That was a direct result of the revolution's attack on the old system.
So he was both a product of the revolution and someone who shaped its legacy in ways no one could have predicted.
Exactly. And Napoleon's impact, it went way beyond the borders of France. His conquests, they spread the ideas of the revolution all over Europe, even though they also triggered resistance and fueled nationalist movements.
So the French Revolution and Napoleon's role in it, they had these ripple effects across the whole continent.
Oh, absolutely. You can't understand modern European history without understanding the French Revolution and Napoleon's place in it. And that legacy, well, it's still shaping the world we live in today, both the good and the bad.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. Enlightenment, American Revolution, French Revolution, Napoleon's rise to power. It's fascinating to see how all these events are connected, even though they happened in different places and at different times.
They really are intertwined, and it's interesting to think about how they still influence our understanding of democracy and human rights today.
So if you had to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from these revolutions as we try to make sense of our own complicated world?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the fight for liberty and equality, it's never really over. It's not like you reach a point and then you're done. It's a constant struggle. It requires us to be vigilant, to be engaged, and to challenge the way things are, always pushing for something better.
It's like democracy is always a work in progress, something we have to actively defend and fight for.
Exactly. Another thing to remember is that revolutions, even when they're fought for the right reasons, they can have consequences that no one intended. They can set loose forces that are impossible to control. They can lead to violence, instability, even tyranny. It shows that change, even positive change, can be messy, unpredictable.
It makes you think we need to be careful what we wish for, because revolutions can have outcomes that we never expected.
That's a good point. And finally, I think it's crucial to remember that the revolutions we've been discussing, at their heart, they were about changing the relationship between the people and the government. They challenged the idea that power should belong to just a small group, and they asserted those fundamental rights of individuals, the idea that power ultimately comes from the people.
So they were all about shifting that balance of power, giving more power to the people.
Precisely. And that's a legacy that continues to inspire and shape democratic movements all around the world, even today.
Wow, that's a lot to absorb. This deep dive has given you so much to think about.
Me too. And I hope our listeners feel the same way. It's been a really fascinating journey through a period of history that was absolutely crucial, and it still resonates with us today.
I couldn't agree more. And to all of you listening, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive as much as we did. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you want to share your thoughts or if you have ideas for future episodes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Welcome to the deep dive.
Oh.
Today we're going way back, like to 19th century Europe, and it's a time just like overflowing with new ideas and, these movements that like really shaped the world around us today. And we're talking about like right after the Enlightenment and how all those powerful ideas about, freedom and reason and stuff really shook things up.
It is fascinating how that all happened, isn't it? I mean, we always think of history as this like straight line,
Right.
but this period is more like a crossroads, you know?
Yeah.
You've got like the French Revolution and Napoleon still like casting this huge shadow. And then on top of that, you have this wave of, totally new ideologies like liberalism and socialism and nationalism all kind of like competing for attention.
Right. And like our sources really get into how all of that went down, especially after Napoleon's defeat in 1815.
Mm.
We got the Congress of Vienna trying to like put everything back together, but also all these new movements like pushing for change at the same time. It's like everyone's trying to figure out, okay, what happens now?
Yeah. Exactly. And the Congress of Vienna is like really key here. Like, think of it as Europe hitting the reset button. All the big powers get together and they're basically saying, look, we just went through like decades of war and revolution. Let's try to like create some balance of power, make sure no one country gets too powerful, and hopefully avoid another Napoleon situation.
So it's all about like going back to the old ways, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like trying to pretend the French Revolution never happened.
Well, not exactly. That's where it gets interesting. You see, the Congress of Vienna, they wanted to go back to the old order, but the Enlightenment had already planted these seeds of change, and you can't just like ignore them. You can't just like erase all those ideas about individual liberty and reason, They're out there, and people are starting to demand a say in like how they're governed.
And that's where liberalism comes in, right? This whole idea about individual rights, limited government, free markets. It feels so familiar, so like modern even.
Absolutely. Liberalism was totally a product of the Enlightenment, and it really challenged the old systems of like monarchy and privilege. It was about empowering the individual, giving them more freedom and control over their lives, and over their government too.
So this is where we start seeing ideas about like free speech and representative government right. Like, hey, we don't want a king just telling us what to do. We want a voice.
Yeah, you got it. And we see this play out in a lot of ways. For example, our sources talk about like Belgium breaking away from the Netherlands in 1830. This was fueled by people wanting self-rule, like a classic liberal idea. And then closer to home, you have Johann Rudolf Thorbecke, who like wrote the Dutch Constitution in 1848. That thing really limited the king's power and gave citizens more of a voice, which was a big win for liberals.
Wow, so these weren't just ideas, they were like actually shaping political events.
Mhm.
But I imagine not everyone was so thrilled about this whole liberalism thing.
Oh, definitely not. Like, change is rarely easy, especially if it threatens the people in power. And as liberalism gained momentum, you see another ideology popping up: socialism.
Okay, so socialism, that's all about equality, right?
Yeah.
Like making sure everyone gets a fair shot, especially with all this huge industrialization going on.
Exactly. Socialism came about as a response to all the inequality and social problems that came with industrialization. Think about it. Like, cities are exploding with people looking for work, living in horrible conditions. Work was dangerous, long hours, terrible pay. Poverty and inequality were everywhere. Socialism was basically saying, hey, this isn't right. We need to fix this, and the government needs to step in and make sure things are fair.
So it's kind of the opposite of liberalism, right? Like
Yeah.
liberalism is about individual freedom, while socialism is more about like the well-being of everyone and the role of the state in making that happen. There are two different answers to the question, what kind of society do we want?
That's a great way to put it. And even within socialism, there were different ideas. You had these radical groups like communists and anarchists who thought that the entire capitalist system had to be overthrown, like completely, sometimes even through, violent revolution.
I can see how with all that rapid change, some people would just want to like hit the reset button on the whole system.
Mhm.
But I'm guessing there were also like less extreme socialists, right?
Yeah, of course. You also had the social democrats who wanted to work within the existing system to bring about gradual change through like democratic means like elections and stuff, things like social welfare programs and labor reforms. These debates about what role the government should play, they're still happening today, aren't they?
For sure. And it's interesting to see how those arguments were taking shape back then.
Hmm.
We've been talking a lot about politics and economics, but what about other parts of life? Did the Enlightenment have any impact on things like gender roles?
That's an important question, and it shows how complicated this period really was. The Enlightenment did inspire movements for social change, but its impact on gender roles was, well, kind of mixed. Feminism, which is all about, women's rights and equality with men, really struggled in the 19th century.
Yeah, I can imagine. Back then, a woman's place was seen as being at home,
Mm.
right? Raising kids, and definitely not out there demanding equal rights.
You're right. The 19th century was all about this thing historians call the bourgeois family ideal. It basically said that women belonged in the home, and that really limited their chances to get an education, get jobs, or participate in politics. So while feminism had its roots in the Enlightenment, it faced a lot of pushback during this time.
So it sounds like progress was slow and probably really frustrating for those early feminists. But I'm guessing they didn't just give up.
Oh, no, not at all. They were pioneers, Like, they were challenging the way things were and making a path for the women who came after them. There were amazing people like Aletta Jacobs. She was the first woman to study at a Dutch university. Can you imagine how much courage that took to break down those barriers?
It's amazing to think about her walking onto that campus and probably everyone is staring at her.
Yeah.
It really shows the challenges those early feminists had to overcome. But it also shows how determined they were to change things.
Exactly. And as the century went on, women's movements started to gain momentum. They focused on issues like voting rights, education, and fighting against problems like prostitution and alcoholism. These were big, complicated problems, and women were the ones on the front lines trying to solve them.
So it's like all these different threads of change are all coming together, like in politics, economics, and in society. It must have been such a dynamic and kind of crazy time to live through.
It really was. And as if liberalism, socialism, and feminism weren't enough to shake things up, there was another powerful force at play: nationalism.
Ah, yes, nationalism. That feeling of shared identity based on things like language, culture, or a shared history.
Hmm.
And that often leads to people wanting to rule themselves right, like we want to be in
You
charge.
got it. And nationalism had this weird two-sided nature. Like, it could bring people together under this shared identity, but it could also tear people apart, especially in empires like Austria-Hungary, where all these different groups were fighting for their independence.
So on the one hand, you have places like Italy and Germany unifying in the mid-1800s, and that was driven by nationalism. But then on the other hand, you have all these conflicts inside these big empires where people felt like they were being ignored or mistreated.
Exactly. Nationalism was like this double-edged sword. It could inspire people to do great things, but it could also lead to conflict and division. And even today, we're still dealing with the consequences of nationalism, aren't we?
Oh, definitely. It seems like just when we think we've figured out nationalism, it pops up in some new way.
It's a force that never really goes away. It just changes and adapts. But one thing's for sure, it totally changed the 19th century, redrawing the map of Europe and setting the stage for conflicts that would happen in the 20th century.
So we've got all these big new ideas, liberalism, socialism, feminism, nationalism, and they're all challenging the way things used to be. But I'm guessing not everyone was happy about all this change.
You're right. In fact, there was this growing backlash against all these new ideas. A lot of people felt like things were changing too fast and becoming too radical, and that's where we see conservatism starting to become a real political force.
So if I'm understanding this right, conservatives were basically saying, hold on a sec, let's slow down with all this revolution and chaos.
Exactly. They were really suspicious of the Enlightenment and all the ideas that came from it. They wanted to hold on to traditional values and institutions, things like the monarchy, the aristocracy, the church. They saw liberalism and socialism and all those other isms as a threat to the way things were, like a threat to social stability.
So conservatism was kind of a reaction to all that change, a way of holding on to what was familiar in a world that was suddenly feeling very different.
That's a great way to think about it. It was about sticking to the old ways, sticking to a sense of order and hierarchy that was being threatened by these new ideas that were more about equality and individual freedom.
And it's interesting to see this back and forth between tradition and change playing out in the 19th century, almost like this tug of war, each side pulling in a different direction.
You nailed it. It was a time of huge ideological struggle, and the outcome of that struggle would go on to have a massive impact on the 20th century and even beyond. But we'll have to dive into all that in our next segment.
Sounds good to me. I'm already hooked, and I can't wait to see how this all unfolds. So we were talking about this like big clash between old ways of thinking and new ideas and how conservatism was like pushing back against all this change sweeping through Europe. But, ideas are one thing, but how did all this like actually affect people's lives back then?
That's the important question, right? And one of the biggest things that changed everything was obviously the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't just about like new machines and factories popping up everywhere. It was like this total transformation of how society worked. People were moving from the countryside into cities looking for work in these like booming industrial centers. Our sources really highlight how this led to a bunch of new problems, what they called the social question.
The social question, huh? What does that even mean?
Well, think about it. Cities are suddenly packed with people desperate for jobs, often living in like really awful conditions, cramped and dirty. And the work itself was often dangerous, with crazy long hours and like super low pay. Poverty and inequality were just everywhere. The social question was basically society trying to figure out how to deal with all these downsides of industrialization.
So it's not just philosophers talking about ideas anymore. It's like real problems affecting millions of people.
You got it. And this is where those different ideologies we were talking about before, like liberalism and socialism, they come in with different solutions. Liberals, they were all about free markets and letting people figure things out on their own. They thought that if the economy was growing, everyone would eventually benefit. They said the government shouldn't interfere too much and should mostly just focus on protecting people's rights and property.
But the socialists weren't really buying that a rising tide lifts all boats argument, were they?
No, not really. They saw capitalism as like this system that just exploits people where the rich keep getting richer and the poor stay poor. They thought the government had to step in, regulate the economy and create social programs to help the working class.
So you've got this like fundamental disagreement about what role the government should play in society. And I imagine these debates got pretty intense, especially as labor movements and trade unions were demanding better conditions for workers.
It was a time of so much social and political activism. Workers were organizing, going on strike more and more, and socialist parties were starting to gain power in parliaments. The fight for workers' rights was really heating up, and it would end up shaping politics for many years to come.
It's amazing to see how these ideas went from being theories to becoming these real political movements that were impacting people's lives. And speaking of shaping things, let's go back to nationalism. Italy and Germany uniting in the mid-1800s, that must have been a huge deal.
Oh, yeah, it completely changed the map of Europe. Imagine these places, some of them divided for centuries, all of a sudden coming together to form these brand new nation states. It really shows you the power of that national identity, of having a shared language and culture and history.
It sounds almost romantic, all these divided regions coming together under one flag.
Hmm.
But I'm guessing it wasn't always so peaceful and harmonious, was it?
You're right to be a little skeptical. The reality of unification was often really messy and sometimes violent. Take Germany, for example. That whole process was basically orchestrated by this Prussian politician, Otto von Bismarck. And he wasn't afraid to use force to get what he wanted. There were wars, political schemes, and tons of backroom deals.
Wow, so it was like a real-life Game of Thrones with huge consequences and powerful people clashing. And while all this political drama was going on, what about the feminist movement? Were they making any progress in this rapidly changing world?
It's important to remember that even with all this change happening, a lot of the traditional views about women's roles in society were still really strong. That bourgeois family ideal that we talked about before, where women are expected to stay home and take care of the family, that was still a really powerful idea.
So I'm guessing that made it pretty difficult for feminists to push for the changes they wanted to see.
Oh, definitely. It was a constant uphill battle. But even with all those challenges, that first wave of feminism did make some real progress. In some countries, women finally got access to higher education, though they often faced a lot of discrimination and prejudice. And by the end of the century, the movement for women's suffrage, that's the right to vote, was starting to gain some real traction.
So even though change was slow and people resisted it, those early feminists were really paving the way for future generations to demand full equality. It's inspiring to see them fighting for change, even when it felt like they were facing so much opposition.
Their determination and courage is amazing. They knew that changing society doesn't happen overnight. It takes constant work, organization, and a willingness to challenge people's deeply held beliefs.
It's fascinating to see how all these things, industrialization, political upheaval, social movements, they were all happening at the same time in the 19th century. It's like this giant tapestry, and each thread is part of this big, complex, and always evolving picture.
That's a great analogy. And what makes this time period so interesting is that it's not just about dates and names, it's about ideas and how those ideas shape history. It's about the choices people make, the movements they join, the struggles they go through, and the things they leave behind for future generations.
And speaking of what gets left behind, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the big takeaways from the 19th century that you think are still relevant today?
Well, one of the most important lessons, I think, is that progress doesn't always happen in a straight line. It's usually messy and unpredictable and full of contradictions. We see this in how different ideologies rise and fall, in the clashes between tradition and change, and in this ongoing effort to balance individual freedom with social responsibility.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and dates, it's about understanding how complicated history really is and how it still affects us today.
Exactly. And as we dig deeper into the later part of the 19th century in our next segment, keep this idea in mind. History isn't just a story about the past, it's a story that's still being written, and we're all part of it.
All right, so we've been through this like crazy ride of political and social change in 19th century Europe, empires rising and falling, all these different ideologies clashing, and like regular people trying to make sense of a world that's changing super fast. What do you think is the most important thing that this era like left behind?
That's a really good question. And it's hard to just pick one thing. But if I had to, I'd say it's this ongoing struggle to make those big Enlightenment ideals work in a world that was changing so quickly. The ideas of individual freedom and equality and progress that gave people so much hope, but they also unleashed all these forces that were really hard to control. Things that led to new kinds of inequality and conflict and social upheaval.
Like opening Pandora's box, right? You get these amazing ideas about freedom and reason, but then all this other stuff comes out too, and it seems like we're still dealing with that stuff today.
Exactly. We see it in all these debates we have today about, what the government should be doing, the balance between individual rights and what we owe to each other, and the challenges of dealing with this globalized world where different cultures and ideas are constantly bumping into each other. So many of the big questions we're asking today go all the way back to the 19th century.
So it's like we're carrying this torch.
Yeah.
They're trying to keep building on all the progress that was made, but also realizing how complicated and messy things can get when you're dealing with these really powerful ideas.
That's a great way to put it. We're part of this legacy, but we also have a responsibility to shape what happens next. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember when we're thinking about history. It's not just some old story, it's something that's still happening, and we're all a part of it.
Yeah, it's like we're having this conversation with the past, trying to figure out why people made the choices they did, what challenges they had to face, and what we can learn from all of it. Hopefully, we can use that knowledge to make better choices now.
Totally. And one of the big lessons from the 19th century is that history doesn't usually have easy answers. It's messy and complicated. It's a mix of everyone's experiences and all their different points of view. And I think that's what makes it so interesting to study.
It's like a big puzzle, right? You keep finding new pieces, and the picture just keeps getting bigger and more complicated. And sometimes you have to like rearrange all the pieces to see things in a new way.
Exactly. That's the cool thing about studying history. It's all about discovery and questioning what you thought you knew and like constantly learning more about the world around us.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the ideas that shaped 19th century Europe. It's been a wild journey through some of the most important events and movements in human history. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely feeling inspired to keep learning more about history.
And as you do, that remember to be curious. Ask questions, challenge the stories you hear, and try to see things from different perspectives. The more we understand about the past, the better we can understand the present, and the better we can shape the future.
I love that. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into 19th century Europe, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll see you next time when we'll explore another exciting chapter in history.